Good morning. Now, Mr. McGregor, we're, I think, ready to begin with Miss
Goldsmith.
Miss Goldsmith. Good morning, Miss Goldsmith. Good to see you again.
And to well,
Now, you're familiar with the arrangements here. You're about to be asked questions by Mr. McGregor. But first, you will take the oath. Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much
Thank
indeed. And remember, I'm hard of hearing, and therefore would appreciate any assistance that you can provide.
Of course.
Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Lord Brady. You're Susan Goldsmith, is that correct?
That's right.
And you've provided a witness statement to the inquiry, which can be found at pages 425 to 443 of Bundle 3 of the witness statements. That's the third witness statement that you've provided to the inquiry. And as with the previous statements, the content of that statement will form part of your evidence to inquiry, but you're also going to be asked some questions by me today. As with previous times whenever you've given evidence, a copy of your statement should be available.
Yep.
If you want to look at it at any point, please just do let me know. Any documents I want to take you to should come up on the screen in front of you. If for any reason you can't see them, please just do let me know.
Okay.
Now, in terms of your background and qualifications, those were covered in your previous statements and in your earlier oral evidence. But in broad summary, you're a former Director of Finance at NHS Lothian, is that correct?
Yes,
And you retired in 2022.
I did.
And during your time working for NHS Lothian, you were heavily involved in what I'll call the project, and by that I mean the new hospital, the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences.
I was.
Thank you. Yeah. I want to really just ask you questions about the period after financial close, up until the point when the hospital opened. And the first issue that I want to ask you about is really the dispute that arose between NHS Lothian on one side and the project company IHSL on the other, regarding the pressure regime in the 4 bedrooms. Do you remember that?
I do.
And if I could just ask you to have your statement in front of you, please. And if we could look to page 434. So we're in bundle 3 of the witness statements and page 434. I may have the wrong bundle of witness statements, so it may either be bundle 1 or 2, but it's
I do have the paper copy in front of me.
Thank you. It's just to bring it up for the co-participants, but thank you, Ms. Goldsmith. So paragraph 29, you addressed the settlement agreement and supplemental agreement 1. I won't read out the whole of the paragraph, but effectively you summarise in there that the dispute came to focus on 14 out of 20 multi-bedded rooms. And if I could just ask you to look to the final sentence, you say that the focus was very much on pressure rather than air changes. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, this is obviously some time ago. There's a number of contemporaneous documents that I'd just like you to look at, really just to see if the focus of the discussions was really solely on pressure or whether there were also associated references to air changes. But I'll take you to each of the documents in turn. Perhaps just to refresh your memory, if we could go right back to the start really of where the dispute began and look to Bundle 13, Volume 9, and page 92. Bundle 13, volume 9. If we could go to page 92, please.
Thank you.
And this is a letter from Jim Crombie to Wallace Weir of IHS Lothian Limited on the 13th of March 2018. If we look to paragraph approximately halfway down the page, beginning, we note that notwithstanding, do you see that?
Yes.
So it says, we note that notwithstanding the independent tester's email dated 23 January 2018, you still not confirmed that you intend to revise the ventilation system to the 4-bedded rooms to meet the board's construction requirements. Indeed, we are dismayed to note that Project Co have not set out their position in relation to the ventilation system to the 4-bedded rooms at all. Do you see that?
I do.
So reference effectively to NHS Lothian saying, let's look at the board construction requirements because we don't think you are complying with our brief. Is that fair?
That's right.
Thank you. And then if we look to the next paragraph, it says in our letter to Project Co dated 3 November, enclosing a report from David Rollison and Associates, and our letter to the independent tester dated 29 November 2017, the board set out the detailed reasons why the ventilation to the 24-bedded rooms requires to be balanced or negative. That position is reinforced by the opinion we have received from senior counsel, which has been provided to you on a without prejudice basis. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, just so I'm understanding things correctly, the board, NHSL's position is the board's construction requirements properly construed require balanced or negative pressure for these 4-bedded rooms.
That's right.
Thank you. And at this point, again, if you could just assist the inquiry, it seems that NHS Lothian have obtained senior counsel's opinion on the legal analysis, but they've also obtained an expert engineering report. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And then if we look over the page onto page 93, I won't read all of that out, but there's really a summary of the board's position and why what's been set out in the previous page is required. And one of the reasons for that is if we look to paragraph 2, it says that really NHS Lothian's position, that would comply with good industry practice. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, you're obviously involved in the financial and commercial side, but is that your understanding of what you're being told by the individuals on the technical side?
Yes, absolutely.
And again, we'll come on and look at this in slightly more detail, but the inquiries heard before that not only was there an in-house estates team at NHS Lothian that were assisting in the project, but there was a company called Mott MacDonald that were appointed as lead technical advisors. Was that your understanding?
That's right.
So again, could you just explain in your own words, at this stage, that there's clearly a very significant dispute between the parties about what these rooms require, what good industry practice requires, expert opinions have been provided, there's the threat of litigation, which is presumably a massive step for any public body. Could you just explain what advice, if any, are NHS Lothian getting from Mott MacDonald at this point in time?
My recollection is that Mott MacDonald supported our position and that for the 4-bedded rooms, the ventilation should be balanced or negative. So my recollection also is that they, as our technical advisors, that they, with the project team, had identified that there was potentially an issue with ventilation. So although we've just referred to documentation in 2018, I first became aware that there was an issue, potentially an issue with ventilation towards the end of 2016, became more of a sort of meaningful issue during 2017. But Mott MacDonald, as our technical advisors and who were part of the project team, were key to picking up that there was issues with the ventilation.
So again, if we just take that in stages, Mott MacDonald involved, NHS Lothian's position on the basis of advice it's receiving from an outside expert and Mott MacDonald, balance the negative pressure for these rooms, that complies with good industry practice. If we fast forward, we know that IOM come in at a much later stage in the process and say, this hospital doesn't comply with good industry practice, it doesn't comply with published guidance. Were there some searching questions asked by NHS Lothian of Mott MacDonald at that point?
There was clearly a concern that that it hadn't been identified by Mott MacDonald. I mean, when you talk about as well, about the people that were involved, obviously there was a clinical view as well. So it wasn't, just engineers and the project team. It was a clinical requirement that the pressure regime should be balanced or negative in those rooms. And clearly the standards, the guidance, SHTM 0301 at the time didn't include any reference to the 4-bedded rooms. And in fact, if you go back in the project, to the start, I recall that gaining a derogation from single rooms was a key consideration and a clinical requirement going back to 2008, 2009, because it was a clinical requirement that we had a mechanism or a facility that would allow the cohorting of children. It was largely about children and not having children in single rooms and control of infection. So yes, certainly when the IOM report, I mean, we were, everyone was devastated. I can't underplay how awful it was that time. And so there's questions not just of Mott MacDonald, but all of us, how had no one identified that critical care should be at 10 air changes and positive pressure. So yes, there was a question of Mott MacDonald, but it's fair to say that, it wasn't just Mott MacDonald that had been party to the requirement for balance or negative and believing that that was the right pressure regime for those rooms, multi-bedded rooms.
We'll come on and we'll talk about other entities, individuals involved in the project. But if we could just perhaps stick with that issue at the moment. Mott MacDonald providing advice, good industry practice, balanced or negative. IOM come in and say, that's not right. It has to be positive.
Yeah.
Were there some searching questions asked by NHS Lothian of Mott MacDonald in relation to their role in the project, having signed off that good industry practice means balanced or negative for these rooms?
If you mean, did we call them in or haul them in and ask them what they've been up to? No, we didn't, because why didn't we? I mean, we obviously took legal advice on our position in terms of Mott's as technical advisors. And I think we have I've obviously been away from Lothian for 2 years, but I think we've got assisted, action. With Mott's, depending on how this inquiry goes. So we certainly took legal advice, but we didn't haul them in as our technical advisors. We were so focused, to be honest, on resolving the problem and the issue that really, at that point when the IOM report was issued and we were in meetings, it was really about rectifying and occupation, ultimate occupation of the building. And to be honest, Mott's had been part of the team. So yes, in retrospect, maybe we should have actually brought in senior partners, and quizzed them, but we didn't at that time.
Thank you. If we could return to Bundle 13, Volume 9, and then look on to page 94. Approximately halfway down the page, you'll see a paragraph beginning, in the event that we do not hear.
Yes.
So Bundle 13, Volume 9, and we're on page 94. Paragraph in the middle beginning, in the event, and the letter continues, in the event that we do not hear from you with confirmation of your position by Monday 19 March 2018, we shall assume that you share Multiplex's view and confirm that we shall raise court proceedings against Project Co seeking an interim order requiring the performance of your obligations under the project agreement pursuant to section 47.2 of the Court of Session Act 1988. Specifically, we shall seek an order ordaining you to design the ventilation to the 20 relevant 4-bedded rooms such that it achieves a balanced stroke negative pressure regime relative to the adjacent corridor. A copy of the draft summons will be provided to you in due course. Do you see that? So threat of litigation, and specifically saying our brief requires balanced or negative pressure and we're going to go to court to compel you to design in compliance with that if you don't agree to do it. Is that right?
That's right.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look on, please, still within Bundle 13, Volume 9, to page 96. And this time it's a letter of the 21st of March 2018 to Wallace Weir of IHS Lothian Limited. And if we look over the page on to page 97, please. First full paragraph states, a significant part of Multiplex's reasoning appears to be that we have not properly explained why infection control would require each of the multi-bed rooms to have balanced stroke negative pressure. We disagree. We would refer you to, amongst other things, MMGC 002408, dated 11th January 2017, and the subsequent discussions at the meeting on 23rd January 2017. These discussions and correspondence dovetail with the relevant extracts from the VCRs SHTM 0301 and SHFN 30, see paragraph 5.4 in particular regarding cohorting patients with the same infection. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So again, communication from NHS Lothian to Multiplex of the clinical need. This is why we need to cohort patients, and this is what we need you to do. I won't read out the next paragraph, but again, there's a reference to the draft summons and supporting affidavits. Then the penultimate paragraph, we cannot allow this issue to remain unresolved. The hospital is already over 8 months late. A further delay pending the outcome of the dispute pursuant to the dispute resolution procedures and Schedule Part 20 of the project agreement is unacceptable. We have therefore obtained the necessary approvals pursuant to our governance procedures to sanction the action outlined in our letter dated 13th March. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, for those of us that don't work within a health board, what would be the approval procedures if you were looking to raise a sort of major litigation like this?
In this case, our legal advisor came to our Finance and Resources Committee to have a discussion about the court action. All members of the board had a right to attend Finance and Resources Committee, and board members were advised, I think, following a board meeting that we were going into a private Finance and Resources Committee, that everyone was welcome to attend to hear the proposition from our legal advisor about court action. And the Finance and Resources, having heard the proposition and with quite a significant amount of discussion, agreed that we would pursue court action. I can't recall how we then advised the board, but the board were certainly, the wider board were certainly aware of the discussion taking place on that same day in Finance and Resources Committee. And I would imagine we then advised them in some way following the discussion, but certainly Finance and Resources agreed the court action.
And would there have to be approval from the Scottish Government for a litigation like that, or is that simply a decision taken by the Health Board independently?
That was simply a decision taken by the Health Board, but throughout all of this, and I think I've said in my previous attendances here that at all times we were keeping colleagues within Scottish Government briefed about how the project was going and the issues that we were facing on ventilation. So again, I can't recall specifically, but we didn't need formal approval for court action, but we certainly would have discussed it with them and advised them that that's what we were planning.
Thank you. Then if we look on, still within Bundle 13, Volume 9, this time to page 100, you'll see that there's an email dated the 22nd of March 2018 from Matt Templeton to a range of individuals, including yourself, really setting out that there is discussions ongoing between the parties at this point in time to see if there's a way to avoid the litigation. So the second paragraph, please find attached a letter from IHSL together with an closed proposal for multiplex. The multiplex proposal stroke letter contains the following 4 attachments. There's a mediation tracker report, 4-bed ventilation options, RHSC liability scenarios, and the PICO change register. Do you see that?
I do.
So Mr Templeton effectively sending through IHSL's position in terms of how this might be resolved. And if we look on to page 101, we see the letter that's sent on the 22nd of March 2018.
Yes.
Again, I won't read out the first page, but really summarising in the first couple of paragraphs why it would be in all parties' interests to try to reach a resolution. And then if we look on to page 102, paragraph in the middle of the page, beginning, one of the key items that needs to be addressed. Do you see that?
Yes.
He says one of the key items that needs to be addressed is the technical requirements of the 4-bedded ventilation to the satisfaction of the board. The attached paper outlines 3 ventilation options, each with a capital cost and timeline to completion. We ask the board considers these options. The attached timeline is based on option 1. It's recognised that were a different solution to be agreed, either in relation to option 2 and 3, then the overall programme and costs will change to reflect the work required for each of those options. Do you see that?
I do.
And then if we look on to page 103, the first full paragraph there, if we could pick matters up, approximately 5 lines up from the bottom of that paragraph, do you see a sentence beginning without agreement?
Yes.
Where it says, without agreement, multiplex could not be contractually compelled to carry out changes post-completion, meaning other contractors would need to be engaged. If other NHSL subcontractors are brought in to do certain works, warranties could be invalidated and responsibility for defects to affected areas of the building may become an unnecessary area of dispute between the board and IHSL. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, as I understand it, a narration from IHSL of some of the difficulties if you have a project company, their subcontractor, and then you try and bring into that deal structure yet another subcontractor. I want to ask you some questions about this at the end, but I'd just be interested in your views in terms of, at this point in time, you're in a revenue-funded project. So it's not as simple as a design and build between health board and contractor. There's the project company in the middle who ultimately owns the building, various side agreements that are taking place between the company that will manage the building, the company that's actually designed and built it. Could you just try and explain in your own words the sort of difficulties and complexities that deal structure created in terms of trying to resolve what seems on one view like quite a simple dispute between is it balanced and negative or positive pressure?
I think one of the biggest challenges for the board was our contractual party was IHSL, but in reality and practice, multiplex were the partner that really held all the cards. They were building the hospital, and although we engaged directly with multiplex, our contract was not with multiplex, so we didn't really have any levers at all or any leverage with multiplex. And at this time, they were obviously, facing some difficulties on the project and were, very tough adopt a very tough commercial position. So an IHSL had a different responsibility and a different funding structure, which gave them different challenges as well. So it was really, at times we tried very hard to negotiate directly with IHSL as our, contractual partner, but found that was, almost impossible. We had to have multiplex in the room, we didn't have a contract. And the funding structure also brought complexities because IHSL had a funding structure with two funders who also had requirements and needed to be satisfied that there was no changes in the risk profile at all for IHSL as the SPV. And so throughout this, the funders were engaged with resolving the issues that we were facing. At different stages, the funders wanted to meet us, the board, to try and seek resolution and get this project resolved. But again, we didn't, they were IHSL's funders rather than our funders. So it was very, it was complex. And really, it did feel at this time that IHSL were facilitating a dispute between us and Multiplex. Although to be honest, through most of it, it felt as if IHSL were supporting Multiplex's position. But when we got to, starting to work through the settlement agreement, IHSL did try and play a facilitation role, although it was with, our contract was with them. So it was complex, and also we had, at our end, we had Scottish Futures Trust, who were really the guardians of the NPD contract, and had an authority, from government about what we could and couldn't do with this contract. And then we had Scottish Government, who were funding the revenue, who also were a stakeholder. So there were a lot of, parties with an interest in this project, and it made resolving the ventilation and other issues and, the understanding the consequences for a 25-year, ultimately ended up being a 23-year project agreement, and what that would mean in terms of IHSL continuing to provide through another contractor the facilities management of the hospital for that long period of time. So there were multiple stakeholders, all with different interests and a different assessment of risk and a different risk appetite. So it was really complex.
Again, just so I'm understanding things, in terms of if there's a simple dispute between the board and the project company, actually to try to resolve that, the board ended up dealing with a range of third parties that it didn't have any contractual relationship with. So you mentioned the funders of the project company, Multiplex, who are effectively the contractor or subcontractor of the project co. The board's got no contractual relationship with them, but is effectively having to try to manage the dispute with that party that it doesn't have any contractual relationship with.
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, at the end of the day, the party that probably felt most sort of on the same page as NHS Lothian was actually the funder, M&G and the European Investment Bank were, did insert themselves into the negotiation and, tried to support resolution. Clearly SFT and Scottish Government had a role as well, and we'll no doubt come on to that as we touch more on the settlement agreement, but SFT also had a facilitation role. But the funders actually did play an important role in trying to mediate and get resolution to this. But yes, it was very complex with a lot of engagement with the different stakeholders. And
again, just at this view, it'd be interesting in your views, just at a very general level, but certainly the inquiries heard evidence that in terms of the NPD model, you were meant to have a project company that had a public interest director that sat on it. The idea being that facilitated a collaborative relationship, a partnership approach between the board and the project company. What are your views in terms of whether that actually worked at a practical level?
It didn't really work, and that wasn't because of the individual, but what we learned, and I think it has subsequently been changed, is that the individual who was the public interest director had a personal fiduciary responsibility, and so we were obviously not aware at the earlier stage of the dispute, but IHSL clearly, became financially challenged, significantly financial challenged, and so the public interest director's prime responsibility personal responsibility was ensuring that actually IHSL stayed whole. And I think that that was a conflict with their role as public interest director, because it inevitably meant that their interest was protecting IHSL's position. That's not to say that, you know, that the public interest director didn't try and resolve the issues, because he was then, you know, sitting around the table, but he was definitely conflicted at that stage.
And again, just perhaps if we could explore that issue of conflicts, you have Scottish Futures Trust, who effectively have responsibility for overall for NPD contracts,
Yes.
is that right?
They do, yes.
They were providing advice and assistance to the health board, is that right?
That's right.
And one of their employees is sitting as the public interest director within the project company.
That's right.
So individuals from that organisation are on the one hand effectively advising the board on the deal structure,
Yes.
but they've also got an individual, as you say, who's sitting as a director with all the fiduciary duties that come with that to the project company.
That's right.
Again, if we're just looking to the future, perhaps, I think you said you didn't think that worked well. How could that be improved if there's going to be revenue-funded projects that happen again? What are your reflections on how you could avoid this scenario of potential conflicts or difficulties whereby actually the health board really just deals with the person that's building it but doesn't have any contractual relationship with them?
I mean, I do think that, just a personal view, that NPD is not an appropriate vehicle for complex acute hospitals. I think it's, you know, just the very nature of healthcare means that, you know, the mechanisms or the way in which healthcare is delivered changes rapidly and is continuing to change rapidly, which means that the facility that from which it's delivered needs to be capable of being changed, and there needs to be a degree of flexibility. And the NPD project structure makes that quite difficult, you know, as a, you know, for boards to deliver change. So I'm almost certain that the public interest director no longer is a full member of the SPV, so, and sits there now as an observer. So if there are NPD projects, I think it's, you know, it's helpful to have an observer hearing the discussions that are taking place around the SPV board, although, of course, no doubt behind the scenes, the more commercial discussions take place without necessarily the public interest director. But I, so it's a personal view, don't think the NPD is an appropriate model for the delivery of very big, complex acute hospitals.
In your view, what would be the optimum model?
I still believe that they should be capital funded. I mean, you know, there is a cap. In the past, there's been a capital budget. You know, I've been on, you know, boards where we've delivered projects that are funded by capital. And I think at the end of the day, if we want good hospital facilities, then we need to fund them with the capital resource that's available through the tax system and the funding system. So that would be my personal preference.
And again, just looking at some of the difficulties that arose here that we've just discussed a moment ago, do you think those types of difficulties would have arisen on a capital build project, or would it have been much easier to try to resolve the disputes?
Yeah. I think it would have been easier to resolve the dispute, because the project team identified, you know, were aware from 2016, you know, because there had been the failure of the pile, there'd been a, you know, one of the suppliers had, you know, went bankrupt. There was evidence that, you know, the project team could see that there were challenges on the site, and did through 2016 become increasingly anxious about the quality of the workmanship. And the project team were on site and were, you know, frequently going round the building and observing. We didn't have a formal clerk of works because it was not a capital funded project. But when I say the team, not just NHS Lothian's team, but Mott MacDonald were observing and identifying issues. So if that had been a capital funded project, then we would have been able to have discussions with the contractor and identify those issues and make adjustments to the or hold them to account more clearly more easily than we were able to. So during 2016, the latter part, 2016 and 2017, there was a huge amount of frustration with the NPD model because we weren't able to actually rectify or influence the rectification of issues that we saw that were emerging on site.
So that the board effectively on the sidelines can see issues that they think are problems, would like to change them.
Yes.
But because of the very nature of the structure, just simply have to sit on the sidelines and have very limited influence.
I mean, they didn't sit on the sidelines, and I guess that's why we ended, it's not I guess, I know that's why we ended up with a settlement agreement that had 81 items listed in it, because through the whole period of, that latter stage of 2016 and 2017, the team with Mott MacDonald's were capturing the issues through, a register. I can't remember what it's called, but the system were recording all of the issues that they were uncomfortable with, and so when we came to the settlement agreement, one of the key issues was that Multiplex knew that the project team, on the ground, the project team were discussing issues with the project manager from Multiplex. And so there was a knowledge, between NHS Lothian and Multiplex that it wasn't just ventilation, there were other issues. So one of Multiplex's key requirements when we eventually sat around the table for the settlement agreement was that everything went on the table, everything, because they said, we want the list. So it wasn't that we weren't doing anything, it's just that it took the settlement agreement, which obviously came with a further capital injection, to actually resolve issues that would have been, dealt with probably more easily as a capital funded project. That's not to say that we wouldn't, as a capital funded project, you wouldn't have had to put more capital money into it, but obviously, every capital project is different, but it was, it just took a long time, and I'm sure then was part, that added to the delay because we couldn't resolve many of those issues until the settlement agreement.
Thank you. If we could look back to Bundle 13, Volume 9, and move on to page 110. This is email correspondence that you probably won't have seen before, because it's from Andy Clapp of Dalmore Capital, and it's really an email to people on the IHSL side. You see it says, "Dear all, please find below a brief overview of the meeting between IHSL and NHSL." Do you see that?
Sorry, where did you see that?
So we're Bundle 13, Volume 9.
Yeah.
And it's the email, "Dear all, please find below a brief overview of the meeting between IHSL and NHSL." So it's referring to a meeting. Then the next full paragraph, "Following the submission of the Multiplex proposal dated the 22nd of March 2018, representatives from IHSL met yesterday with NHSL at their offices. Jim Crombie, Susan Goldsmith and Ian Graham attended from NHSL, and Tony, Andy and Matt from IHSL. The premise of the meeting was to ensure that NHSL had properly understood the proposal and whether there were any clarification points we could answer." Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, I won't summarise all the bullet points, but it effectively says that the court action has been taken off the table, and there's a summary of what certainly from the IHSL side was discussed. Now, if we could look over the page onto page 111, and you see the first bullet point beginning, "NHSL advised." If we could just pick matters up 4 lines up from the bottom of that paragraph, do you see wording, "NHSL agreed to progress on the basis of ventilation"?
Yes.
So certainly from the IHSL side, they're recording their understanding of what's discussed at this meeting that you're at, and they say NHSL agreed to progress on the basis of ventilation option 2 in the MPX paper, balance stroke negative 4AC/HR to 14 rooms. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, again, it's a long time ago. I appreciate that you probably went to a lot of meetings, but having seen that, certainly the recollection of the IHSL side, do you remember for the 4-bedded rooms discussing the solution being both balanced and negative pressure and 4 air changes per hour?
I do recall the discussion about 4 air changes per hour, but really in relation to single rooms, I'm not saying I wasn't aware of the discussion about the number of air changes in the 4-bedded rooms, but I don't specifically recall that, but I do recall the air changes in relation to the single rooms.
And in fairness to you, you're obviously at this meeting, there's a range of people there. Presumably you are more interested in the commercial aspects of the resolution, and there's other people there that would be perhaps more focused on the technical aspect.
No, absolutely. I relied on the team, with the technical advisors to come to, an agreement on those technical resolutions.
And again, I'll just ask you to look at a couple more emails that talk about the technical solution. Again, if your recollection is these things might have been discussed, but I don't remember them, it's a long time ago, please do just say at that point.
Thank you.
So if we could look to Bundle 13, Volume 9, and it's the email at the bottom, email from Brian Curry of the 29th of March, 2018. So that's Bundle 13, Volume 9, page 113. So Mr. Curry contacting Darren Pike, and he says, catch up at 2 p.m. this afternoon, but in advance we have prepared our thoughts on a collaborative framework going forward. See attached. This has been approved by principals within the board. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we look on to page 115, there's the collaborative framework. I won't read out point 1, but just below the point 1 above point 2, do you see there's wording, these works will incorporate?
Yes.
It says these works will incorporate agreed balance stroke negative ventilation specification works to the multi-bedded rooms, scope being 14 rooms at 4 ACH/HR. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, do you recall any discussions with Mr. Curry or what's referred to in that email as principals within the board wanting to move forward with IHSL to resolve the pressure issue on the basis of balanced and negative pressure, 4 air changes per hour?
Again, I do recall that was part of the agreement in terms of moving forward, and I certainly recall the 14 rooms being balanced or negative. But as I said earlier, I'm sure I obviously knew, but I just don't recall the discussion for the multi-bedded rooms on the 4 air changes. Thank you.
And then if we could just look on to Bundle 13, Volume 9 at page 116. This is an email from Darren Pike on the 29th of March 2018 to a range of individuals, including Andy Clapp, James Crombie, and you see yourself, Susan Goldsmith, listed there. Do you see that?
I do.
And what Mr. Pike states in this email is, Jim, Susan and Ian, action from me from the call earlier to circulate and confirm the following. Our understanding is that 14 number 4-bed wards are to have 4 air changes per hour at a negative or balanced pressure, and this will satisfy NHSL requirements for these spaces with regard ventilation. Do you see that?
I do.
And then I won't take you through all the emails in the chain, but if we just go forward, Bundle 13, Volume 9 to page 189. So we're now at the 28th of June 2018 letter from NHS Lothian to Wallace Weir of IHS Lothian Limited. Do you see that?
Thank
I
you.
do.
And then just under the bold heading, without prejudice, the second full paragraph states, as previously advised, the schedule sets out what the agreed resolution for each dispute item is, as well as describing the technical solution for each dispute item. Further obligations incumbent upon Project Co and the board to achieve the technical solution are also stated. Do you see that?
I do.
And then if we just look down to page 218, please. See, there's a draft of item 7. Do you see that?
I do.
And if we just look to the right-hand box, so that's the description of agreed resolution. So Bundle 13, Volume 9. The front page of the letter is page 189. And then the schedule is at page 218. Right-hand box, description of agreed resolution, second full paragraph, the resolution submitted, and then there's some track changes by Project Co through the review procedure is for 14 bedrooms be balanced or negative to the corridor at 4 ACH/HR. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, I won't take you to the actual technical schedule to the settlement agreement, but there's some minor tweaks, but that draft effectively becomes the technical schedule. But should the inquiry understand from the email chain that we've looked at that really there was quite a detailed process that led up to what was ultimately captured within Settlement Agreement 1?
There was a very detailed process, which, took some time.
Whenever you were negotiating Settlement Agreement 1, was one of the concerns on the board's part the potential for there to be a change in the entire risk profile of the deal? Because the inquiries heard that with the NPD model, if it works perfectly, all of the design risk should be shifted from the public sector onto the private sector to the project company. So whenever you were looking to agree that the settlement agreement, did you have any concerns that agreeing that the settlement might impact on that deal structure?
We did have a concern, but the reason we mitigated that concern by ensuring that we had legal advisors who, were sitting alongside us, and there were attempts by IHSL to change the risk profile in their favour through the process. And that really was part of my role. A significant part of my role is to ensure, with Ian Graham and the team, was to ensure that there was no shifting of risk to the board, because although this was a change, the settlement agreement was trying to capture what essentially we were paying for, and what we'd agreed, we had to ensure that the risk didn't change over the 23-year period. So at all times, we had a legal advisor who was giving us advice on what was being proposed for the settlement agreement, to ensure that there was not that shift in risk to the board. Thank you.
And if I could just ask you to look to Bundle 13, Volume 9 at page 184. So Bundle 13, Volume 9, page 184. This is an email from yourself to Andy Clapp, Tony Rose, Matt Templeton. We see the first point that you raised there is the NHSL business case, the fact that there'd have to be a business case that was put forward to justify any settlement. And then if we look to point 2, which is headed full and final settlement, and pick matters up with the final sentence in the first paragraph, you say, I believe that the current approach set out in the settlement agreement is somewhat artificial and no doubt unintentionally cuts across the existing risk profile in the project agreement. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, is that just the concern you had that, yes, you wanted to agree changes, but you didn't want to fundamentally alter the deal structure that had been signed off in all the business cases and ultimately entered into by the board.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then if we look over the page, there's some, I think, suggestions to the wording put forward. Then at page 185, within the first full paragraph there, we look approximately 5 lines up from the bottom of the page. You sort of summarise, I think, your position. There's a sentence meaning this avoids any change to the risk. Do you see that?
I do.
You say this avoids any change to the risk profile under the project agreement and therefore protects both parties and would remove the need for the drafting around disputed items, dispute and released claims, which would not be acceptable to the board in the current form in any case. To be clear, it is not proposed that this process would alter the settlement sum, which is the subject of the separate issues I have outlined in item 1 above and item 3 below. Do you see that?
I do.
Thank you. I'm going to take you to an email in a moment, an email exchange between Graham Greer of Mott MacDonald and Brian Curry, and it's really about this issue about what is the brief, what is the design, where does design risk sit? But I'd just be interested in your views before we go there. In terms of Settlement Agreement 1, was that a document which from the NHS Lothian side was seeking to change the brief? Or was it seeking to alter the design solution? What was your understanding?
That's a good question because it's difficult. I wouldn't have articulated it in that way. I would have said that there were a whole range of technical issues which not having a technical background, some of them related to design. So, for example, the one I remember most, because I remember the discussion about it, was drainage. So the hospital had not been designed in a way that matched our board construction requirements. So it had been designed in a different way. And the board were not happy because we saw that there were potential operational risks. But the hospital, you couldn't, once the hospital was built, you couldn't change the drainage solution. So the board was put in a position where we had to find a way with IHSL and Multiplex to mitigate the risk through other mechanisms. And so that SE1 captured what we had agreed would be acceptable to the board. So that cut across design and the brief. And there were other issues where we believed that IHSL had not, or Multiplex had not constructed the hospital to the brief, which were design issues. So, for example, I think there was an issue about the cable calculations and the loading of the cables, but it was too late, really, to change the infrastructure of the hospital, and so we were agreeing what would be a solution to our perceived risk, that where it had been designed, the hospital had been designed in a particular way, that we felt there was a risk against our brief. And so at all times we were trying to get that captured in the settlement agreement, what we thought the issue was and what the solution was. So it cut across both the design and the brief, but all through the lens of, how this hospital was going to function and what the risk would be for the board.
With the benefit of hindsight, and I appreciate you're now looking back, I'm not asking what your thought process was at the time. Do you think there is a confusion in relation to Settlement Agreement 1, whether the technical schedule is the NHS Lothian brief or whether it's the design solution.
Sorry, say that again.
Do you think that there's an ambiguity in Settlement Agreement 1 in relation to the technical schedule as to whether the technical requirements set out there, as to whether they are NHS Lothian's brief or they are the design solution?
I'm not sure. Yes, there is an ambiguity, and it would have been almost, although, you could take a purist view of, the design responsibility is with the project co and operational brief and responsibility and board construction requirements, are the board's responsibility, and we tried to keep that purist line all the way through this. But the reality is, if the board spotted something, that was questionable about the design, which it did, in terms of, if I take the cable calcs, or if the board spotted something that was questionable about the design, then it would have been irresponsible of the board not, just ignored that because it happened to be the SPV's responsibility or IHSL's responsibility. So the ambiguity arose because, I think it's quite a purist view that you keep the two completely separate. And again, I'm not technical, but from a non-technical perspective, inevitably we cut across, in picking up issues that were of concern to the board, then we cut across the design. But ultimately, the settlement agreement is very clear that design responsibility and, through the live period still rests with IHSL. So if anything emerges in the future that is, relates to design, then it's the responsibility of IHSL.
Because perhaps if we just take things stage by stage in terms of how matters develop with the threat of litigation, but as I understand it from the documentation we've looked at, NHS Lothian's position was the board construction requirements were the brief, is that right?
That's right.
And the board construction requirements properly construed required balanced or negative pressure for these rooms. Is that correct?
Yes.
So whenever we see the technical schedule with all the agreements, is that not really just NHS Lothian clarifying their brief to the project company? This is what we want.
It makes it very clear what the board has agreed. So yes, very simply, yes, it does. It documents what the board has agreed meets its brief, and essentially what we are buying or paying for. It makes it crystal clear. Where there wasn't clarity before, perhaps.
Thank you. And if I could just ask you to have a look at an email exchange between Graham Greer of Mott MacDonald and Brian Curry. It's in Bundle 13, Volume 5, at page 1272. So Bundle 13, Volume 5, page 1272. And if we could pick matters up just in the third paragraph, please.
Thanks.
Where Mr. Greer states, I think the intentions from IHSL were constructive. We all just wanted to close the technical issues. And I think we're agreed that all items are to be defined with precision. However, the comment about the BCRs is concerning. As you've described in your email, in effect, we had thought the process would conclude in the board removing any further objections to the design solution proposed and recorded via one of the mechanisms already established in the contract. The risk allocation set out in clause 12 of the PA is clear, and I am concerned that if the board agreed to write the above BCR statements, it could significantly alter the PA risk allocation in IHSL's favour. Furthermore, I don't think the board is in a position to fully confirm compliance with the BCRs. The burden of responsibility should always remain with Project Co. As we are not the designers, Mott MacDonald would not be in a position to provide that design assurance to NHSL. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you recall any discussions with Mr. Curry or other members of the project team about that issue, about is this a design assurance issue, and if it is, Mott MacDonald aren't going to be providing any design assurance?
I don't recall that. I'm sure I probably was party to it, but it's not something that I can remember.
Because again, it's just, I think, for the inquiry, trying to clarify exactly what Mott MacDonald's role is at this point in time. So the inquiry's heard evidence from Mr. Greer, who was very clear that Mott MacDonald assisted NHS Lothian, provided ad hoc advice, helped with the drafting of the technical schedule to the settlement agreement. But his position is that that was being done on the understanding that Mott MacDonald weren't really providing any form of real design assurance. And I think it was just to try to understand your understanding of what MacDonald were doing at this point in time, because certainly Mr. Greer's analysis, and it's not to get to the bottom of what the correct legal technicalities are, it's more to try and understand what people thought was happening. Certainly Mr. Greer's position was that, yes, Mott MacDonald are helping out, they're doing their best, but they weren't really advising or taking any responsibility for the solution that ultimately ends up being into the settlement agreement. What was your understanding of what Mott MacDonald are doing in terms of the settlement agreement?
My understanding was that Mott MacDonald were providing assurance to the board, or advising the board, that the IHSL were delivering a hospital that would meet the board's construction requirements. I think inevitably there was some, as I said earlier, there were some draw into design issues but that was, again, if you take the cable calculations, that was because it wasn't, we considered, or the technical advisors and the team considered, that the solution that was in place would not meet the board's construction requirements. And so there was a question mark about whether it or not. I mean, again, as somebody who's not technical, I find, I sometimes find it quite difficult to, to have that purist view, because the two are so interlinked. The board construction requirements are reliant on the design, the correct design. So inevitably there were some discussions that cut across design, but Mott's responsibility, simply was to ensure that the board's construction requirements were delivered by IHSL and give us advice where they didn't believe that they were being met.
So that obviously is your understanding. That
Yes.
might be different. Other people may have different recollections. Yeah. Again, we'll come on and talk about the Grant Thornton report later on, but one of the issues that the Grant Thornton report raises is it's not often clear when decisions were being made, how they were being documented, what specific advice had been provided. If we were looking to another project and there's a similar dispute that crops up and there's these types of issues, is the design risk changing? Is it a brief change? Is it a change to the design solution? How do you think this type of issue could be done better, so that there was crisp, clear capturing of who's doing what and who's advised on what particular issues? How could that be done better?
I think that when I look at the decisions that were made from a commercial, financial perspective, those are all very formalised in terms of, a proposition, a paper, goes to finance and resources, legal advice, documented. And I think certainly by the time I left Lothian, there was work well underway on ensuring that there was much, we had set out how technical advice is received, and being clear about, where we have technical advisors as part of the team working alongside NHS Lothian, and where we're relying on their professional indemnity. I guess that's the key distinction. So I can't remember the detail of what was being proposed, but we were certainly clear that we needed to make that distinction. So if you appoint technical advisors, for this purpose, they're just providing advice as part of the team. If you're requiring them to give us formal professional advice that is supported by their professional indemnity, we need to make that clear. So I think it was just that distinction was perhaps lacking and needs to be, or formal. It wasn't. It requires to be more formalised than it was.
So greater clarity in terms of roles and greater clarity in terms of what's specifically being done, and in particular, if advice is being given that is being relied upon, that's clearly and crisply captured so that there's no dubiety as to who's advising and what they're advising on. That's right. Thank you. In the run-up to the conclusion of Settlement Agreement 1, so by that I really mean the period throughout 2018, whenever the discussions are taking place, the project team, the core project team, are obviously working very hard on trying to resolve all of these issues. The inquiries heard evidence from Dr. Inverarity and Lindsay Guthrie, who were infection prevention and control professionals working within NHS Lothian. They say that they really didn't have any involvement in those discussions, and they simply learn about the conclusion of Settlement Agreement 1 by a sort of all-staff email. Why were infection prevention and control not involved in the process of discussing the solution and documenting the solution?
I mean, Donald himself personally wasn't, but certainly the infection control team were part of the wider project team, and certainly the discussion on the multi-bedded rooms included infection control. I mean, before we agreed the proposition on the 14 rooms being shifted to balanced or negative, Janice McKenzie engaged with clinical team, including infection control. So the project was structured in a way that infection control were part of the wider team and would be part of the discussion at any point where there's issues of prevention and infection control to be considered. But SA1 was essentially a commercial agreement, and I guess I wouldn't have expected Donald to be involved in a commercial settlement, but his team were involved earlier in the project, and certainly as involved in any clinical discussions on solutions.
The inquiry has also heard evidence that there's an HEI scribe process that's embedded within the NHS. Presumably you don't know the detail of that, but you'll have heard the term HEI scribe.
Yes, I do, yeah.
And that's a 4-stage process, with stage 4 being a check that should take place before the new build hospital is effectively handed over. So if it's a design and build, handed over from the contractor that's building it to the health board. Are you familiar with that concept?
I am, yes.
Now, the stage 4 HEI scribe wasn't completed before Settlement Agreement 1 is signed and the hospital is accepted by NHS Lothian, handed over. Why did that not take place?
That didn't happen then because essentially the settlement agreement was a commercial business settlement, and part of so the site, this is one of the challenges that we faced, and we go back to the discussion that we've had in previous hearings where the board was clearly very focused on the programme. And by this time we had seen significant slippage in the programme, and there was a concern that we would go into another winter where moving into the facility would be challenging. And so as part of the settlement agreement, recognising that it's always better to move services, acute hospital services during the summer when it's quiet, not that services are quieter any time of the year now, but they're marginally quieter in the summer. And so the board was cognizant of making sure that we tried to capture, having lost, however many summers, try and ensure that the move happened over the summer. And so as part of the settlement agreement, we agreed that we would run commissioning in parallel, which we always knew was going to be really challenging for the board, So when the settlement agreement was signed, essentially the hospital was still a construction site. There was still work ongoing on the issues that were the drainage, the void detectors, I can't remember what else. So it was essentially, still the contractor was still on site, and there was a lot of work done to determine how the commissioning team would work alongside a contractor on site. And there was designated zones that were contractor zones and designated zones where we were able to get on with our commissioning. So you wouldn't have been able to undertake the scribe process while the hospital was still a construction site. And really it was, only once the work was concluded would you be able to test the systems. And I guess that's where we ended up with a problem, because the testing was so late. The ability to do scribe and then the commissioning, the board commissioning was so late that, by the time we identified a problem, we had to defer, or the Cabinet Secretary deferred the opening. But so it was because it was a construction site, it was a commercial agreement, and the scribe process would not have been possible while it was a construction site.
But if we just think about that and think about that term, the scribe process, for a moment, if settlement agreement 1, there might be a dispute about whether it's changing the brief or it's changing the design solution. Surely the clock should have been wound back in the scribe process to the stage 2 sign-off, because that's where there has to be the stage 2 scribe for the design process. So why was the thought process on the part of NHS Lothian, we will just defer the stage 4 scribe? Why weren't they looking back if they were either changing the brief or the design to the stage 2 of the scribe?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't think I'm best placed to answer that question. I'm sorry.
Again, I'm just interested in your views. Obviously, everyone who's working on settlement agreement 1, as you say, is really focused on the commercial angle. Looks like the clinical angle, the IPC has been sorted out with the decision that you need to cohort patients. But do you think, again, looking back, that the lack of infection prevention and control input was perhaps problematic because the detailed knowledge on the scribe process simply wasn't embedded in the individuals that were focused on the commercial side of the deal?
So I suppose I would just reiterate my point. There was infection control input throughout the project. I mean, there was facilities input, there was a wide sort of multidisciplinary input to the project. With the benefit of hindsight, perhaps there wasn't the right level of infection control input, and the profile of infection control, in a relatively short period of time in the health service has, increased enormously. We know much more about the relationship between, you'll have heard there's multiple factors that influence infection control, but the relationship between the building and its infrastructure and infection control has, I would certainly be aware that it's got a much heightened profile and is much better understood than it's ever been before. And that, that certainly emerged, that heightened awareness and corporate awareness certainly emerged through the life of this project. And so, with the benefit of hindsight, I think it was the level of infection control input, could have been improved.
Because again, the inquiry's heard evidence that really the infection prevention and control aspects of the built environment, so how IPC really links into the water systems, the ventilation systems, that was effectively an emerging area 2007 right up to 2014 and beyond. Again, as someone who has obviously worked within a health board, sat on the board, has been through a project like this, looking back, is that your reflection as well, that this was something that it's easy for us to sit here in 2024 after the COVID pandemic and say, why didn't this happen? But this wasn't something that really generally health boards were thinking about on these types of projects.
No, and to be honest, there was much more flexibility from a clinical perspective. So I guess that's one of the reasons that, the SHTMs are guidance and, not mandated, so it certainly didn't have the profile that it does now, the standards and the guidance. And clearly, there was issues emerging from Queen Elizabeth that then also started to infiltrate, into our consciousness as part of as the project was being concluded. So no, that absolutely would be my recollection.
Dr. Verarity gave evidence yesterday, and he said one of the reasons he was concerned whenever he found out about Settlement Agreement 1 and that the HEI Scribe Stage 4 hadn't taken place was that very issue that he knew from late 2018 into to early 2019 that there were emerging issues at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, potentially with the water and ventilation system. Was that something in terms of the individuals involved in the commercial side? Is that something that those individuals were aware of in February 2019 whenever they were signing Settlement Agreement 1?
Oh, I can't recall. I mean, we were certainly becoming aware and, trying to use our networks to establish, what the issues were. I would struggle to pinpoint, when it was, my sense of it is that it was after the settlement agreement, but I think I'm guessing, I'm trying to retrofit possibly, I just can't remember.
And again, please just help me, in terms of the decision, was it a conscious decision, we'll sign Settlement Agreement 1, we'll accept the hospital, and we'll skip the Stage 4 scribe and do it later, or was there just no consideration of the Stage 4 scribe? What was happening at Settlement Agreement?
I don't recall a discussion about the Stage 4 scribe. What I do recall is the fact that there's, I was certainly aware as the director that there was a huge amount of work to do on commissioning, and that would include the Stage 4 scribe. So there was the issue of, all the equipment that had to be put in place, that was the board's responsibility and tested. There was work to do in terms of packing up and, getting the teams ready for the move. So there was a huge amount to do. And this high scribe Stage 4 would just be one component of, I do remember the lists, of items that had to be worked through by the commissioning team, and that would have just been one. But I mean, clearly there was a very strong imperative to sign in the settlement agreement because of the financial difficulties you'll have heard of because of IHSL, and there was a debt repayment that was due, I think, in the March, for which IHSL had no funds. So, all of us that were involved in the settlement agreement from a corporate, Scottish Government, SFT, myself and my team, was about trying to ensure that we met that timescale.
We'll come on and discuss that in a moment, the financial position of Project Company, but leaving the financial position to one side, this is a hospital now that's already late.
Yes.
How much pressure did the project team feel under to just get this over the line and deliver the hospital?
To be honest, I think they felt more pressure when they could see that things were not going particularly well on site. So, as I said earlier, during 2017 in particular, there was a huge frustration and concern building up. I mean, it was, and then relationships became difficult. So I think there was, at that point, the pressure was probably quite, well, I said frustrated. When you can't control things and you're frustrated, that creates more pressure. I think there was a huge pressure on the team, but, with the settlement agreement, there was such relief that, there was a pathway to the hospital opening. I think that generated a bit of, excitement, to be honest, that at long last, and also the hospital was looking fantastic. It just, there was a pride in how the hospital was looking. And so a real enthusiasm that at long last we were actually getting there. But I was also aware that there was, they felt the responsibility to undertake the commissioning well, having spent all this time overseeing, getting the project to, through the different stages, that nobody wanted to not deliver a good commissioning programme. So I don't think pressure, it was bad pressure, it was good pressure.
And again, Dr. Inverarity, he gave evidence to the inquiry, and he said really the main concern he had about the stage 4 HEI scribe not being completed was that NHS Lothian accepted the hospital without having checked that it was fit to be occupied by patients. Looking back, is that a decision that perhaps shouldn't have been taken, or do you think it was still commercially justifiable? Well,
we did actually have the independent tester. So there was a formal process which was the formal process that SA1 linked to was the project agreement. And so there was an independent tester who was a technical individual. And I mean, one of the reflections was that he was another person who didn't actually make any reference to critical care. So it's just factual, So there was a technical process linked to project agreement that, did whatever he did to ensure that the board was receiving, the hospital that it, had paid, contracted for. So there was a formal process with an independent tester, but that again was linked to the contractual position, as opposed to is this hospital, commissioned and ready to receive patients, which was the commissioning of the hospital.
But at a time, whereas I understand that NHS Lothian's understanding was that the specification for the hospital was fully compliant with all published guidance, including SHTM 031.
Yes. I mean, at that point, anyone within the team would have anticipated that critical care would have been tenure changes and positive pressure. Although, yes, we'll no doubt come on to that. But
again, it's just so I'm understanding things correctly, and it's really to see what assurance, if any, NHS Lothian took from the independent tester's certificate. But am I right in thinking that certainly on the NHS Lothian side, the assumption was if the independent tester is issuing the certificate, regardless of whether that's under the contract or it's against published guidance, that wouldn't matter, because the NHS Lothian understanding was they were exactly the same thing.
Absolutely, yes. And we would have expected the independent tester to identify any issue where that wasn't the case.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask you a few questions about the commercial context of the deal. And perhaps the easiest thing is just to look back to your statement, please. And if we look on to page 435 and to paragraph 32. And within paragraph 32, approximately 6 lines up from the bottom of the page, there's a sentence beginning, in short, SA1 provided. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you tell us, in short, SA1 provided financial support for IHSL who were facing financial distress without which they may not have been able to complete the hospital. Okay. Can you just explain in your own words, what are the financial difficulties as you understood them, and how significant are they?
So the way in which the SPV is set up is that they only start receiving payments from, so IHSL would only start receiving payments from NHS Lothian once the hospital has been completed and accepted by Lothian, at which point we start paying the unitary charge, the annual revenue charge for the hospital. IHSL was set up with a loan structure financing that assumed that they would be in a position to start repaying or servicing their debt to both M&G and to the European Investment Bank following completion in July 2017. We're clearly now in 2019, and IHSL have not had a source of income as anticipated for 18 months. If I recall correctly, the way in which the financing was set up, there was sufficient provision within the costs that IHSL, the budget that IHSL had, to ensure it had for covering its costs in advance of the flow of the unitary charge, so that they're funded so that they have resource that allows them to fulfill their roles and responsibility up to handover of the building. So they did have resource, but they didn't have sufficient resource for an ongoing, to cover that, period. But within their financing, they had sufficient resource. There was a reserve that allowed them to make payment for the first, to service the first payment on the debt. And so I think we had to agree that that could be released. But by the time we got to the settlement agreement, there was no cash within IHSL to make the second payment, which was due to M&G and European Investment Bank. And if I recall, that was due in the March 2019.
And what were your concerns if settlement agreement 1 hadn't been signed?
Well, IHSL would have gone into default of the project agreement. The project would have been further delayed because the funders would have had to have stepped in. We had a right of termination, but the funders had first right to step in. So although we could have terminated, it didn't mean we could then step in and take over the hospital. Effectively, we had an agreement with the funders, so they had a right to try and sort the issue, take over the running of the project and get another SPV, or if Multiplex were not there anymore, get another contractor, but another SPV in the first instance. And we didn't know how long that would take, and we would also then effectively have had to reimburse for the hospital, because clearly we would have been taking ownership of the hospital at some point. And I'm not sure how this calculation was made, but we had a financial advice that indicated we would have to pay IHSL £150 million to take the hospital as it was constructed at that point. And clearly NHS Lothian didn't have £150 million. It would have had to be agreed by Scottish Government. And at that point, as I understood it, Scottish Government didn't have £150 million that they could make available to us to reimburse IHSL and the funders. So there was a significant pressure to agree the settlement agreement and to get the flow of funds so that IHSL remain liquid.
So again, just so I'm understanding things, standing back, looking back retrospectively, it's perhaps very easy to say, why didn't you do the stage 4 HI scribe? Why didn't you just let matters play out as they should? But should the inquiry understand from a commercial perspective, you didn't really feel that you had the luxury of time, really from two perspectives. On the one hand, there's an absolute demand and need for a brand new hospital in Edinburgh, and there's the potential for a cliff edge moment with a payment of up to £150 million landing on either NHS Lothian's desk or the Scottish Government's desk for this project. Absolutely,
and importantly, no certainty on programme, which we've discussed, in previous inquiries. No certainty in when the hospital would become available for patients in Lothian and staff. So So, we did spend a lot of time considering all our options and taking technical financial advice and and legal advice on whether it was a viable option for the board to allow the IHSL to go into default of its debt obligations and how we could take on the building. So there was a lot of discussion about that, but we concluded it just was not in the board's interests.
Thank you. And I think if we could look on to Bundle 13, Volume 7, page 1049, we'll see a minute of the Finance and Resources Committee from the 19th of September 2018. So Bundle 13, Volume 7, page 1049. So we see Finance and Resources Committee, minutes of a meeting on the 19th of September 2018. And then if we look over the page onto page 1050, paragraph 15.2, we see there's an update on the RHCYP/DCN project. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it states, Mrs. Goldsmith tabled a position paper on a proposed settlement agreement. The paper provided detail and an update on the current situation with the RHCYP/DCN project. There was discussion on the IHSL financial difficulties. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, that's one line in a minute which simply records the IHSL financial difficulties. But should the inquiry understand, albeit it's stated in very matter-of-fact terms, what that's recording is all of the difficulties you've outlined in terms of potential insolvency, risk to the project,
yes,
potential bill of £150 million. Yeah. Those are the types of issues that are being discussed and recorded in this minute.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And it continues, the need for a finalised supplemental agreement to move forward, the factors delaying the signing of this and the position of senior funders, residual technical issues with the key issues being around drainage systems, amendments to the business case, the leadership and competency around IHSL and the next steps to make progress. And then 15.2.1, the committee noted the current position with the project and gave its absolute support to the project team in terms of the current strategy and approach. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, although we are slightly back in the chronology here, we're in September 2018, is that strategy to effectively agree a settlement agreement so that this project can move forward and the hostel can open?
Yes, yes, that was very much the objective of the board.
And again, perhaps just to close off this chapter, again, it's to look back at that issue of the deal structure, the whole NPD model, theoretical transfer of risk from the public sector to the private sector. But if you're staring down a scenario whereby the project company is potentially going to go bust with a half-built hospital, is it ever going to be realistic for a health board like NHS Lothian to simply walk away?
No, I mean, the board has a responsibility to deliver, safe services to the, citizens and patients across NHS Lothian, and that's its prime responsibility. So I think the risk ultimately sits with the public sector.
Thank you. Lord Brody, I'm conscious that's just after 11:30. That would certainly be an appropriate point from my perspective to take a break if that was convenient.
Yes. As you perhaps recollect, we usually take a coffee break. So if we try and be back for 10 to 12.
Okay, thank you.
Please.
Mr. McGregor.
Thank you. If I could ask you to have in front of you, please, bundle 4, page 9, which is a letter from Wallace Weir of IHSL to Brian Curry on the 31st of January 2019. So bundle 4, page 9. So at this point in time, we're a few weeks before settlement agreement 1 is formally signed, albeit, as the inquiry understands, actually the agreement in relation to the multi-bed rooms was reached in 2018, and the works have actually been completed at IHSL Multiplex's risk, albeit the contract isn't formally signed until the February. So when we're looking at this letter, 31st of January 2019, all of the works for the ventilation system have actually physically been completed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if we just look over the page onto page 10, please, you see that the letter states in bold, all critical ventilation systems inspected and maintained in line with Scottish Health Technical Memoranda 0301, ventilation and healthcare premises. Construction, all ventilation systems have been designed, installed and commissioned in line with SHTM 0301 as required. Systems are maintained in such a manner which allows handover at actual completion to meet SHTM 0301 standards. Operations, all critical systems will be inspected and maintained in line with Scottish Health Technical Memoranda 0301, ventilation for healthcare premises. Do you see that?
I do.
Albeit this letter is addressed to Mr. Curry. Is this a letter that you had seen in the early part of 2019?
It is.
And can you just explain in your own words, how much reassurance, if any, did NHS Lothian take from the terms and contents of this letter?
I mean, if I recall, the letter was, on the back of an issue, I think, at Queen Elizabeth with pigeon droppings, I think. Assurance, we certainly took assurance, but I don't think it was, we wouldn't have expected anything else. So I think we noted it and accepted it, but that's probably as far as it went, to be honest.
Thank you. And again, I'd just be interested in your views. Obviously, you've been Finance Director of NHS Lothian, sat on the board of NHS Lothian. One of the issues the inquiry is interested in is both decision-making and governance. On one view, what happens in this project is a spreadsheet error or a technical misstatement at some point in the project. And perhaps individuals looking in could say, well, why wasn't that spotted? Why wasn't there governance checks that took place? Why aren't there checks and balances to spot this? Could you just chat us through the process as someone who has sat on boards providing governance? If you were provided with a letter like this that says there's full technical compliance with published guidance, would you be expecting to do anything more in terms of doing checks before entering into an agreement like Settlement Agreement 1?
No, we wouldn't, because we rely on, in this instance, we had a contract which brought with it obligations, and we had a process agreed with the independent tester giving us assurance that our contractual requirements had been met. So quite simply, that's what the board had in place, and the board would expect that that system, would provide assurance to the board.
So the board puts in place the system and then it effectively relies on the system to make sure that the decision-making is done in an adequate, proportionate manner.
Yes, I mean, I guess management put the system in place, and then the board has a system of assurance that relies on the management systems being tested. But yes, the board, there are systems of control in place for numerous things, and this was just one of them.
Thank you. And just in relation to I think you mentioned the systems that the board had in place, and including advisors. If we could just look to the board minute of Lothian NHS Board, which is within Bundle 13, Volume 7, page 1159. So Bundle 13, Volume 7, page 1159. So this is a minute of a private meeting of Lothian NHS Board held on Wednesday, the 6th of February 2019.
Thank you.
And if we look over the page onto page 1160, you see that item 37 is final draft supplementary agreement RHSC/DCN. Do you see that?
I do.
So is that effectively what I've been referring to throughout as settlement agreement 1?
That's right.
And if you look to 37.2, 3 lines down, you'll see a sentence beginning, the board was asked to receive.
Yes.
Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says the board was asked to receive assurance that all negotiations on the terms of this settlement agreement had been supported by the board's legal and technical advisors. In addition, the board approved the settlement agreement with IHSL and considered a short extension to the long stop date to allow all commercial and technical matters to be concluded. Do you see that?
I do.
So that's the formal sign off by the board, but taking reliance from the legal and technical advice that had been put in place.
That's right. And being regularly briefed, you know, in advance of the formal process.
Thank you. And just in relation to the governance structures that were put in place for the project, were they reviewed by Audit Scotland and Scott Moncrieff at a later date?
The structure, the governance around the settlement agreement was reviewed and found by both Scott Moncrieff and Audit Scotland, and they identified that there had been good governance around the signing of the settlement agreement.
To your understanding, in terms of the settlement agreement being signed off, if there were problems with that document, it wasn't a systemic problem in terms of the governance structure, certainly according to Audit Scotland and Scott Moncrieff.
That's right.
You'll be aware that at a later stage, so settlement agreement 1 is signed, at a later stage, infection prevention and control aren't able to formally sign off the stage 4 HAI scribe.
Yes.
And it's then at that point that IOM Limited come in and they do their testing and identify, on their view, a non-compliance with published guidance SHTM 0301. The next part there, so IOM come in, and then the next big chapter would be High Value Change Notice 107 and the Settlement Agreement 2.
Yes.
So at this point in time, when IOM are doing the testing, it's balanced and negative pressure, 4 air changes per hour for certain critical care rooms. And there's then a later agreement whereby it's determined that it's going to be positive pressure, 10 air changes per hour.
Yes.
The inquiry heard evidence from Dr. Inverarity. His position was that effectively Scottish Government simply said this hospital must comply with published guidance, and it's then for the board, and by that we'll come on and look at the Oversight Board, the ESG,
Yes.
but effectively Scottish Government said it's got to comply,
Yes.
and NHS Lothian then implement that decision. Is that your understanding of how we get from the IOM testing to Settlement Agreement 2?
Yes. Although the board, so yes, it is. So simply yes. But the board did also consider how it could get critical care, so it could implement, ensure that critical care complied at a later stage. So there was a consideration about the work's been done at a later stage to ensure that critical care complied with the guidance.
And can you remember who is it that communicates down the chain from Scottish Government to NHS Lothian that simply the hospital's got to comply with the published guidance?
That I wasn't party to that discussion at all, but it would be the Director General.
So your understanding is that you're operating within the project team, Director of Finance, but those types of decision were being taken really one level above that?
Yes.
But your understanding from what you've been told by colleagues is
Yes.
Scottish Government simply said it's got to comply with the guidance,
Yes.
10 air changes per
Yes.
hour and positive pressure. Thank you. In terms of decision-making structures, the inquiries heard evidence that there's an incident management group established, which is then renamed as the Executive Steering Group.
Yes.
Can you just explain what that body was and what your involvement was with it?
Yes. So, as a management team, an executive management team, as you'd expect, we have had management meetings, routine management meetings. But when there is a critical issue, then we set up a separate, more regular forum for meeting. And so the Executive Steering Group was established to bring the key directors together every week to oversee all the work involved in actually agreeing what needed to be rectified, to have an opportunity to discuss within Lothian how we were dealing with things, to consider the practical implications, to get advice from our advisors, and to be able to have the opportunity to consider everything before we engaged with Scottish Government colleagues and NSS.
Thank you. And you tell us within your statement that that was really discussions about technical, commercial and operational issues, is that right?
Yes.
There was also an oversight board that was established.
Yes.
Can you just explain in your own words, what was the oversight board and how did it come into being?
The Oversight Board was established to allow Scottish Government key directors within the Health Directorate to engage formally with directors from NHS Lothian and directors from NSS, and to ensure that all the discussion and consideration of the issues around rectification and indeed some enhancements and the programme for delivery were considered within a formal meeting that was, had an agenda, minutes were taken, decisions recorded. Occasionally there's always that engagement with Scottish Government colleagues and other boards, but this allowed key directors to come together in a formal way to ensure that everything was recorded appropriately.
Thank you. And just in relation to that revised governance structure, effectively in the period leading up to Settlement Agreement 2, if I could ask you to look, please, to Bundle 13, Volume 3, and to page 696. So Bundle 13, Volume 3, page 696.
Thank you.
So you see there's a graphic there really setting out the project governance structure.
Yes.
If we look on the right-hand side, on the NHSL side, right at the very top, you've still got the board of NHSL, but we've got the executive steering group sitting below that. Is that right?
That's right.
And that's the group that you talked about, which was effectively so that there could be this coordinated discussion in relation to various issues relating to the project.
Yes,
is that right?
That's right.
And then we see really sitting in the middle, we've got the project team. Now, there's mention of Mary Morgan sitting there. Obviously, we've talked about the project team, which originally would have included Brian Curry, yourself, Ian Graham, for example. What was the revised project team and how did Mary Morgan come to be involved?
So I would not be part of the project team because I was the lead director. So the project team was led by Brian Curry. In effect, Scottish Government appointed Mary Morgan as, was it programme director, I think her title was, and she essentially came in and led the project team and reported directly to the Oversight Board. She also worked alongside me and the executive team and supported us because the board still had its own governance. The board remained the statutory authority with the contract, and the second supplementary agreement had to be signed off by the board. So Mary her responsibility was to the Oversight Board, but she also supported us in the board.
Thank you. And then on the left-hand side, we see that we've got the Oversight Board, and then below that, a commercial subgroup with your name next to it,
Yes.
S. Goldsmith. Can you just explain, why was the commercial subgroup of the Oversight Board formed, and what was your role within it?
The subgroup was formed because there were some significant challenges in securing a supply chain for the rectification of critical care and other works that were to be undertaken. And there was a lot of detail around that those commercial arrangements. And to be honest, there wasn't really enough time in the Oversight Board to get into the detailed discussion that was required around the commercial arrangements. So the subgroup was set up, chaired by myself, to consider all the matters that were emerging with IHSL and WEAG and then Multiplex. In essence, what it did is it formalised what would have happened in practice. So I've talked before about working with SFT, working with Scottish Government colleagues, working with other parties. So this was it was at a more senior level because it included, for example, the Chief Exec of NSS, it included the then Director of Finance in Scottish Government Health, but it formalised the arrangements for engagement around the commercial arrangements with IHSL.
Thank you. And if we're just looking at those top graphics, so on the left-hand side, we've got the Oversight Board, and on the right-hand side, we've got the Board of NHSL. Yeah. How's their engagement towards Scottish Government? Is that coming from the Oversight Board, the Board of NHSL, or another entity? How are matters escalated to the Scottish Government?
Through the Oversight Board.
Through the Oversight Board. Thank you. If I could ask you to look to the Oversight Board terms of reference, Bundle 7, Volume 2 at page 352. Bundle 7, Volume 2, page 352. So you see that this is the Oversight Board, the terms of reference, and this iteration is July 2019.
Thank you.
And if I could just ask you to look on to page 354, please, we see that the background set out, which states, following the decision to halt the planned move to the new hospital facilities on 9 July, an Oversight Board is being established to provide advice to ministers on the readiness of the facility to open and on the migration of services to the new facility. Do you see that?
I do.
So in broad terms, is that the issues that are being discussed within the Oversight Board?
Yes.
And then if we look down the page, towards the bottom of the page, there's box 3, which is the scope of work, which says the Oversight Board will provide advice in relation to, and then there's a range of matters. So the first is advice on phased occupation. Do you see that?
I do.
There's obviously issues identified with the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People at this point in July. Were there similar issues in relation to the Department of Clinical Neurosciences? Why couldn't it simply have opened immediately?
There were no issues in relation to DCN, and there was a discussion about whether there was a phased move into DCN because there were issues with the facility at the Western General Hospital. So my understanding, and again, I was less involved in this, that there was options were put forward to have a phased a move with DCN going into the facility. I think there was perhaps some issues with rotas of staff, where those rotas were going to be joint, that might have created problems, but certainly that was considered.
But was that ultimately a decision for the Scottish Government
It
when
was,
the DCN
yes,
did
it
or did
was.
not open? Thank you. We see the second bullet point, to provide advice on the proposed solution for ventilation in critical care areas and on any other areas that require rectification works. Do you see that?
I do.
But is that against a backdrop that certainly by this point, by July, when the Oversight Board's being formed, certainly in your evidence, the Scottish Government have already said it's got to comply with the guidance, positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour in
That's
critical care?
right.
Thank you. And then we see advice on the facility operational readiness to migrate, gain information and give advice to NHS Lothian about commercial arrangements with IHSL for completion of works. And then the next bullet point, the approach to NPD contract management. What was being discussed within the Oversight Board on the approach to NPD contract management?
I'm not sure that we. I'm not sure that would be a right description. We needed to use the NPD contract to secure the changes. So Peter Reiki, as I think the then chief exec of SFT, was on the commercial subgroup. So we did talk about the challenges we were facing with delivering the changes that were required with IHSL. So actually, perhaps that is a right description, but the actual detailed discussion around the board changes was undertaken in the commercial subgroup.
Thank you. And then the final bullet point there in terms of the scope of work, it says that the Oversight Board, one of its areas for advice is identification of areas that could be done differently in future. Do you see that?
I do.
What did the Oversight Board determine, if anything, in terms of areas that could be done differently in the future?
I don't recall that we discussed what could be done differently in future at all.
Can you recall why not? Because there's this board that's set up, it's all of these various tasks to iron out perceived problems. It's asked to identify areas that could be done differently, but certainly the inquiry isn't in possession of any crisp report or minute that says these are the things the Oversight Board should do differently. Do you know why that wasn't closed off by the Oversight Board?
I would just be speculating, but I think that at some point during this year, and I can't recall exactly when, and the policy decision was made on the establishment of NHS Assure. And I would surmise that any changes that were going to be made to the capital project procurement and delivery would be considered through the establishment of NHS Assure. And so really that was taken away to was a different area of work. So that would be I'm speculating, but I think that's possibly the reason why.
In terms of, if we just focus on the material in front of us, Oversight Board established one of the things it's to do is identify areas that could be done differently, but ultimately the Scottish Government didn't insist on the Oversight Board providing any learnings in terms of its ideas on what could be done differently in the future.
I don't know, but certainly the Mary Morgan sat around the Oversight Board, and she has, as chief exec, would have responsibility for the establishment of NHS Assure. So I'm assuming that learning from supporting us on the project would be factored into the establishment of NHS Assure, but it wasn't something that we considered. It was probably a good early example of NSS coming in and working with the board on standards and how those should be delivered. So I'm assuming that there was learning from that, but it wasn't formalised in any way.
Thank you. And then if we look on to page 355, we'll see that the membership of the board, I won't go through everyone that's listed there, but we see a range of individuals from Scottish Government, a range of individuals from NHS Lothian, and individuals from other organisations, including Scottish Futures Trust. Do you see that?
I do.
If I could ask you to look to bundle 3, please, page 8. You see there's an agenda for the Oversight Board. Do you see that?
I do.
And if we look at item 3 there,
Yep.
so this is one example agenda. I'll not take you through all of them, but you'll see that item 3 there is ventilation solution, air changes per hour and pressures for all clinical areas against SHTM standard, works required to bring acceptable standard. Do you see that?
I do.
And did that effectively become a standing item in the agenda for each of the Oversight Board meetings?
As I recall, it did. Until we had, until we had an agreed solution, and then it was about the delivery of that solution. But it certainly took some time to agree the solution.
And then if we look still within bundle 3, if we look on to page 43, you see that there's an Oversight Board minute of the meeting on the 8th of August 2019. Do you see that?
Yes.
Range of people attending, including yourself. And if we then look over the page onto page 44, see the bold heading 2, ventilation solutions.
Yes.
2.1, Mr. Graham presented the previously circulated paper regarding ventilation in the critical care area. Members agreed in principle that if a technical solution was designed that would allow 10 air changes per hour in the required rooms in the critical care area, which complied with the relevant SHTM standard and was properly implemented, then the critical care area would be fit for use. Do you see that?
I do.
So is that effectively the agreed solution to the problem that the Oversight Board then works on implementing?
Yes, I think so. Yes, sorry, I'm just reading the second paragraph. Yes, those were the plans that would deliver the solution.
And then if we look on to page 46, please, you see bold heading 6 is commercial position and contract management, which all seems to be blanked out on your copy.
It's blanked out, yes.
I won't take you through everything, but could you just summarise your understanding of what was being discussed on the Oversight Board in terms of the commercial position and the contract management? How was the problem going to be resolved?
The problem in the Oversight Board, probably at this stage, we were still, so I can't recall when this meeting was, but...
this meeting's in August of 2019.
August 2019. So we would be updating the Oversight Board on the progress we were making with IHSL and other stakeholders to identify, or we'd be updating them on the progress we were making with securing a supply chain. And I can't recall whether in August IHSL had secured a supply chain, but there were significant challenges in IHSL securing a supply chain. So there was a piece of work to develop the plan and the design for the ventilation, but in parallel we were working through how this work would be delivered and what that would mean for the project agreement. So I am guessing that it was just an update.
Thank you. If we could look on to bundle 3, page 142, please. So bundle 3, page 142. This is a minute of the Oversight Board on the 29th of August 2019. Do you see that?
I do.
Again, a range of individuals attending, including yourself. If I could ask you to look on to page 144. Again, you're obviously sitting on the Oversight Board because of your financial and commercial input, but there's also going to be discussion on ventilation issues as well while you're there. And the minute records 1.6.1, literature review now complete. demonstrated limited and suboptimal evidence around air changes and clinical outcomes. Most evidence had been expert opinion, modelling and outbreak reports. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you remember any of those types of discussions taking place whenever you sat on the Oversight Board?
I do remember there was a lot of discussion about all of the, not just the ventilation, but, other enhancements. But I would struggle in terms of that specific point. I'm not exactly sure why a literature review was undertaken. But I do recall there was a lot of discussion about, best practice.
Would that effectively be for other people within the Oversight Board to deal with rather than yourself?
Absolutely.
And then if I could just ask you to look on to page 145, please, and to section 7, migration planning at the bottom.
Yes.
It says clinical risk assessment of the potential move to the children's outpatient services in the new hospital in advance of inpatient and associated services. Ms Gilly stated that there was too much risk to manage working across a split site and moving some services ahead of other services. It was noted that DCN could move in one block and all children's services also in one block. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, could you just please tell the inquiry, what was your understanding of the discussions about how the migration was going to take place? There's the solution that's being worked on. Presumably that has to be done for the children's hospital, but how were decisions being made in terms of when the hospitals would open?
As I recall, the decision on the move rested with the Cabinet Secretary, and so so that it wasn't a decision for the board, and this would just relate to a consideration of the plan, so that the revised plan, because the previous plan obviously had all services going in a particular phased way over 10, I can't remember exactly, but a week or 2 weeks. So the plan for the move into the building had to be revised because of the works that were being undertaken. So I think this would just be a consideration of what the options were for moving services in, and how that, I'm not sure that it would have been much different from the previous plan, but I assume that's all it was.
But ultimately at this point, this is now a decision that's been taken by the Scottish Government, which would then be implemented by NHS Lothian.
That's right, yes.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look on, still within the same bundle, bundle 3 to page 531, please. So bundle 3, page 531, which is a minute of the Oversight Board from the 5th of December 2019.
Thank you.
And you see at the bottom there, there's item 4, commercial arrangements paper to NHS Lothian Private Board for December 2019. Do you see that?
I do.
If we look over the page onto page 532, please. If we pick matters up at the first bullet point, it states the NHSL Board had taken their governance responsibility seriously, and whilst not happy about the current situation, realised that this was the only option available to progress the opening of the hospital. The board reluctantly agreed to the proposal. The NHSL Board had requested Oversight Board approval of the decision which they were agreeing to, as it was appreciated that the NHSL Board would be signing the public sector up to unknown financial risks and currently no programme certainly associated with progressing with the proposal. They wished this concern to be made clear to the Scottish Government and Cabinet Secretary, given how the actions of the NHSL Board may be viewed in the future. Do you see that?
I do.
And then at section 5, we see reference to the high value change 107 ventilation works to paediatric critical care and haematology oncology. And then there's references to the Oversight Board approving that the high value change. Can you just explain your understanding of what were the commercial arrangements that are being discussed here in section 4?
I'm not just trying to remember. So one of the issues was that because we couldn't secure, or IHSL could not secure the works to be done through the normal mechanism, that if this had been a board change, then Bouygues, as the FM provider, would have delivered the change. And because they didn't, they would not agree to that. And clearly we Multiplex had also ruled themselves out of doing the change because of the commercial arrangements that they wanted to be put in place. We had to secure the works through a different IHSL had to secure the works through a different contractual mechanism. And if I recall correctly, there was still an unknown about the financial cost of this at this point. So we had to agree the solution and the works without absolute certainty on the cost and the programme at this point because of the urgency of getting on the works.
If we just think back to the original business case that was presented for the new hospital, presumably that had to set out in great detail what the financial position was going to be for the lifetime of the project. Is that correct?
That's right.
You then go through a procurement exercise to supposedly get to a point where you have a fixed contract whereby all the risks, liabilities and costs are known. Is that correct?
That's right.
But you get to a point towards the end of the project whereby we see the Oversight Board discussing and the Board of NHSL discussing that actually we've now got to a point where there's going to be what's described as an unknown financial risk to the public sector.
Yes.
Again, just reflecting on the whole NPD structure, which is meant to take a situation where all of the risk simply goes on to the private sector. I'd be interested in your observations as to how the NPD model is operating from a health board perspective.
Well, in this case, clearly it didn't work to, as it, is supposed to work. And, as Director of Finance, then, there was certainly, I had some concern that we were prioritising investment, in this area, recognising that we had to do the works. But we given how financially constrained the capital budget is across the NHS in Scotland, then this, because of the nature of the works and the timescale and the pressure, the works were prioritised and delivery of the works were prioritised compared to the budget. So I think I spoke before about the quality cost criteria and the cost criteria being given a greater weighting than the quality at an earlier stage in the project. This obviously flipped at this point where quality was the key driver, including, including the enhancement works and the financial arrangements. So the financial budget was less of an issue.
Again, in terms of what would ultimately become settlement agreement 2, that's formally entered into by NHS Lothian.
Yes.
But we see the Oversight Board here communicating that really NHS Lothian wanted it to be clear to the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary just exactly what those obligations and liabilities were going to be.
Yes.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look on, still within bundle 3, to page 928, please. And this is a minute of the Oversight Board on the 23rd of April, 2020. Do you see that?
I do.
So bundle 3, page 928. Bundle 3, page 928.
Thank you.
Oversight Board minute of the 23rd of April 2020. And if we could look on to page 930, please. You see section 5 is progress with ventilation remedials and fire enhancements. 5.2 is HVC 107 design sign-off, which states the Oversight Board accepted the assurance from Mott MacDonald Technical Advisors, Health Facilities Scotland for NSS, and the authorising engineer that the specification for air handling units meets NHS Lothian's requirements for critical care and haematology oncology. The Oversight Board agreed to approve sign-off of the specification to allow IHSL and IMTech to procure the air handling units. The minor derogation in the spare capacity of the units, 25% down to 18 to 19% was noted. Do you see that?
I do.
So is this effectively at this point in time the Oversight Board approving the changes that are going to be made, albeit it's the project company that will implement them, but this is the new, whether it's the new brief or the design solution, this is being signed off by the Oversight Board?
It is, yes.
And that's on the basis of assurances provided by a range of entities, including Mott MacDonald, Health Facilities Scotland and an authorising engineer?
Yes, that's right.
If I can ask you to look on, still within bundle 3, this time to page 1082, please. This is a minute of the Oversight Board from the 14th of January 2021. So bundle 3, page 1082. You see at section 2.2, there's reference to publication of SA2. Noted SA2 had now been published with redactions and was available on the NHSL website along with the project agreement. Do you see that?
I do.
So is that effectively, by this point in time, high value change notice 107 and the settlement agreement 2, which formally records the change, including for critical care units, to positive pressure, 10 air changes per hour, that's been signed and it's publicly available for anyone to review that wants to see it. Thank you. And then if we look on, still within this minute, to page 1084. Within any other competent business, at paragraph 6.1, see the bold heading, technical assurance, page 1084. 6.1 noted that the Oversight Board on 19th November 2020 had discussed the HFS role in the completion of commissioning and testing, confirmed that HFS had been involved throughout the process, and once the IOM report was available later this month, HFS would only get involved if there was anything substantive identified as an issue. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, should the inquiry understand that HFS has really been involved right throughout this process in terms of signing off the solution, the implementation, and then the formal testing by IOM Limited?
Yes.
If I ask you to look on, still within bundle 3, to page 1095, please. We have a minute of the Oversight Board held on the 25th of February 2021. Do you see that?
I do.
And if we could look on to page 1097 and look to the final 2 bullet points on the page. You see that the second last bullet point states, Miss Morgan outlined that the last year had been spent correcting the pressure cascade in the new hospital. In that period, the critical care and Lochranza ward ventilation systems had been rebuilt, cams had been stripped out and reopened, and all other items in the HFS report had been addressed. The new hospital was now one of the safest and best buildings in the whole of Scotland. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, Mary Morgan, who I think you've said was brought in as the senior programme director, she's not a member of the Oversight Board, but attends the Oversight Board and is providing an update. And she's saying in her view, now that all of the changes have been carried out, testing done, that this new hospital was one of the safest and best buildings in the whole of Scotland. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, is that characteristic of the discussions that you're having on the Oversight Board at this time, that you've now got to a point in time where all the works have been done?
Yes.
The minute continues, to delay the final service moves further when no issues relating to ventilation piece had been identified would be very risk averse. Do you see that?
I do.
So again, should the inquiry understand, certainly from Mary Morgan's point of view at this point in time, she doesn't have any concerns about the hospital opening?
That's right. Yes.
And then the minute continues, Miss Gillies stated that it was not clear why the previously discussed and agreed course of action now appeared not to being followed. Mr. Morrison confirmed that there was a desire not to end up in the same place as July 2019 and recognised that this could be seen as an overly risk averse, but testing and exploring options was part of having as much assurance as possible that the previous position would not be repeated. There was support for the direction of travel to continue the plan for week commencing 23rd March 2021, but to wait until the independent tester report is received before any public announcements. And then over the page on to page 1098. Continues, Miss Gillies made the point that in July 2019, the independent tester did not pick up the issues that stopped the moves last time. The 2021 IOM report has been done in conjunction with others, and so no surprises were expected as the data around the ventilation systems had been shared. This was an important difference from July 2019, and rectification work now had been done on the back of working with NSS. Do you see that?
I do.
So was there effectively a disagreement between attendees as to when precisely the hospital should be opening?
I'm not sure that, I'm just trying to recall what that discussion was about. And again, I think it was more about the public announcement. I think that the date was agreed, but it was more about the public engagement, and particularly with staff. I think that we were probably wanting to engage with staff, and we were being required to wait a bit longer.
Thank you. And if I could just ask you to look towards the final minute that I want to take you to of the Oversight Board, so that's in Bundle 3, page 1496. So Bundle 3, page 1496, which is a minute of the Oversight Board of the 8th of April 2021.
Thank you.
And if we look to point 2, which is NSS action log closeout, do you see that?
Yes.
And 2.1 states the circulated action log spreadsheet from Ronnie Henderson, Commissioning Manager, Hard FM, NHS Lothian, showing all actions now closed following discussions and correspondence with Ian Storer was accepted. Do you see that?
I do.
So by this point in time, effectively, the Oversight Board has been set up with a specific task of taking all issues with the hospital and resolving them. By this point, 8th April 2021, had all of that work now been completed?
Yes.
And then we see point 3 in the minute is the closing of the Oversight Board. 3.1, the Oversight Board referred to the originally agreed terms of reference for the group and accepted that it was now clear that the point of completion had been reached. Do you see that?
I do.
So by this point in time, successful completion of everything that had been on the Oversight Board agenda. In relation to what became Settlement Agreement 2, I think you've mentioned in both your statement and in your evidence that IHSL remains in place, but it wasn't Multiplex that ultimately ended up taking the works that were set out under Settlement Agreement 2. Is that correct?
That's right.
Within the period of time from the original IOM testing, so just before the hospital was originally due to open, were there discussions that took place with Multiplex in terms of whether it would be able to provide solutions or rectification works to achieve what NHS Lothian wanted now, namely positive pressure or 10 air changes per hour?
There were discussions. I can't recall whether those were between IHSL and Multiplex only, or whether we were in the room. We were certainly in the room with Multiplex at different points after the IOM report, but I just can't recall whether we were in the room or it was a two-way discussion.
Thank you. Perhaps it might be helpful just to refresh your memory to look at some of the contemporaneous documents in relation to these matters. So if we could look to Bundle 7, Volume 1, please, and to page 101.
Thank you.
Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 101, an email from Brian Curry to Matthew Templeton, copying in a range of people, including yourself. And then it's really the email approximately halfway down the page beginning, it's Mr. Templeton's beginning, Brian, I understand arrangements. Do you see that?
Yes.
So it says, Brian, I understand arrangements are in place for the design workshop tomorrow with both IHSL and Multiplex attending, which is good. Can we please allocate some time following the design meeting to discuss and agree the basis upon which we're progressing? In the circumstances, we agree it's important we commence the design process immediately and without delay. However, it's equally important that we understand what is being requested of IHSL and their subcontractors. Do you see that?
Yes.
So at the point IOM have done their testing and identified potential problems, in the immediate aftermath, do we see that there is some form of engagement here from IHSL and Multiplex?
There was, yes.
And again, we'll come on and look at the detail, but can you remember exactly what was being discussed at this point in time?
Well, at this point in time, I mean, at Multiplex were, as the contractor and the designers, they had all the information on the specification for ventilation. So at that point, they had to be in the room in terms of the discussion on what could be done to rectify the ventilation. So those were technical workshops. I suppose just previously when I talked about Multiplex, whether we were in the room with them, I was more thinking about the commercial discussions, but in the technical workshops, yes, Multiplex were there.
Thank you. Because if we look on Bundle 7, Volume 1 to page 311, Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 311, you see that there's a minute of a meeting on the 11th of July 2019, range of individuals attending, including yourself. And then if we look over the page onto page 312, you see at point 2.3, there's a heading critical care design. Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, it stated Brian Curry advised that he had met on Tuesday with Multiplex managers and done a tour of the area where the following options had emerged: increased capacity of air handling unit to deliver 10 air changes per hour, find a room to install an additional unit, and thirdly, identify external space to put in a larger air handling unit. Do you see that?
I do.
So discussions with Multiplex being involved in relation to whether there could be changes made to the system. Do you recall the discussions, if any, taking place with IHSL and Multiplex at this time, though, in relation to the commercial side? So it looks like on the technical side, there's engagement from both IHSL and Multiplex in terms of trying to help with the technical solution. Do you remember discussions around about the commercial side as to how, if there's going to be rectification works, how they would be done and who would pay for them?
To be honest, I do remember the discussions about how the work was going to be delivered, but I would struggle to recall at what point. I'm sorry, we started that discussion because the first priority was identifying a technical solution. So there was a huge focus on how would this be resolved, and that was the first priority. But there certainly were discussions about the commercial arrangements. I just would struggle to know exactly when those started.
No, it's a long time ago, and it's not a memory test. So perhaps if I could just ask you to look to Bundle 7, Volume 2, and to page 176. So Bundle 7, Volume 2, page 176. And it's the email from Matthew Templeton to yourself on the 31st of July 2019. Do you see that?
Yes.
Thank you.
And if we could perhaps just look to the second full paragraph beginning IHSL and their supply chain. Do you see that?
Yes.
Which says IHSL and their supply chain require a clear and clean instruction from NHSL to proceed with the required amendments to the critical care ventilation, backed up by an obligation on NHSL to pay for the design, installation and any additional FM/lifestyle costs. Furthermore, the IHSL parties do not wish to proceed with any amendments to the critical care ventilation where NHSL are reserving their rights in respect of any alleged breach of the PA/SA with respect to critical care ventilation as signed off by the independent tester. Do you see that?
Yes.
So just in terms of the commercial side, what's being communicated to you here from the IHSL multiplex side?
So IHSL were prepared, were working very closely with us to get a solution to the critical care, rectification works to critical care. But as I understand it, by roundabout at some point during this time period, Multiplex made it clear that they would some of their what's that? I can't remember the terminology, but they would, if there was any future problems with the ventilation, then there would be no comeback against them. So they were already starting to identify their commercial position at this point. And I think it's probably around about this point that it became clearer that getting Multiplex to the works was going to be difficult because of their commercial requirements.
And again, just thinking back to the discussion that we had earlier today about the whole model here, is this what you mean by some of the difficulties, that your relationship is with IHSL, but you have their subcontractor that's actually done the physical works? You need to engage with them, but you don't have any direct contractual relationship with them.
Yes.
And again, some of the difficulties perhaps on the multiplex side, that they're saying, we're nervous about altering this contract because there's a whole web of other contracts that could have implications for.
Yes.
Thank you. And if we could just look on Bundle 7, Volume 3 to page 308. So Bundle 7, Volume 3, page 308.
Thank you.
Bundle 7, Volume 3, page 308. And it's to the email from Margaret Kinnis to yourself, Brian Curry, and various others. So we're now at the 22nd of August 2019. You see that email states revised draft LOI. Is that letter of intent?
Letter of intent, yes.
And a draft contractor collateral warranty now issued to IHSL and MPX legal advisors to reflect discussion yesterday. Please see attached. Do you see that?
I do.
So certainly by this point, it would seem that there's been some engagement, at least so that there could be a letter of intent and collateral warranties being drafted. Is that on the basis that you're still anticipating that IHSL and Multiplex would potentially do the works?
Yes, it must be.
But there came a point where those negotiations broke down. I think you'd mentioned that there were contractual difficulties perhaps, or other commercial positions that simply meant that there wasn't a resolution that could be agreed.
That's right.
And again, just for completeness and perhaps for the chair's benefit, if we could look to Bundle 7, Volume 3 to page 326. Bundle 7, Volume 3, page 326. So this is an email on the 30th of August 2019 from Matthew Templeton to Stephen Gordon and other people. And it's discussing what's headed up call with Susan Goldsmith. Do you see that?
I do.
There's no formal minutes of that call, so it's just to see whether what's recorded in the IHSL multiplex side accords with your own views. So you'll see that there's the points 1, 2, 3, if we could perhaps just pick matters up just above that. So in relation to the telephone call, Mr. Templeton says, Susan provided the following rationale for the NHSL decision, which has been ratified by the Oversight Board, and Christine McLaughlin was due to be briefing the Cabinet Secretary. 1, NHSL consider there to be poor engagement from the designers TUV Sud. There's clearly a clash between TUV Sud and NHSL's project team, and indeed Brian Curry has been requesting for weeks that MPX consider an alternative designer. Do you see that?
I do.
Again, is that your understanding, thinking back of the types of discussion you were having with Mr. Templeton?
I do recall that multiplex were very, very commercial and made this difficult. I know there was issues with the designer. I do recall it was a very difficult time because there was clearly a pressing need to get on with this.
And then if we look to point 3, it says NHSL has a lack of confidence MPX will resolve the IOM ventilation issues. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you remember having a discussion like that with Mr. Templeton?
I do, yes.
So should the inquiry understand that really by the summer of 2019, NHSL is at a point that it's really lost confidence in Multiplex's ability to rectify matters?
Yes, I mean, at the start of this, when we had the IOM report, Multiplex did engage quite positively about resolving issues. But by the time we had reached the end of the summer, then the relationship was becoming quite fraught again.
Thank you. And then if we just look towards the end of that email, just the penultimate paragraph, Mr. Templeton says, I briefed Ben Keenan on the above, and MPX are considering, although he stated it was highly unlikely MPX will participate in critical care given no waiver is being provided. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, is that back to the discussion we had a moment ago whereby you indicated that Multiplex took a particular commercial position, yes, and if there wasn't going to simply be a waiver of rights by NHS Lothian, yeah, they were unlikely to engage further? Absolutely,
and clearly for the board, again, it goes back to the point that this is a contract over many years. To be able to give a waiver in an area such as critical care was not going to be, you could not take that kind of risk.
And we've obviously looked at the Oversight Board minute that recorded the discussion in relation to the fact that creates quite a difficult situation on a revenue-funded project. Yeah. That you still have the project company in place, yeah, but their contractor isn't going to take place in any of, yes, the rectification works. And that can have significant financial consequences. And if we look on to Bundle 13, please, Volume 9, to page 335. So Bundle 13, Volume 9, page 335 is a letter from IHS Lothian Limited to you, dated the 26th of November 2019.
Thank you.
And if I could ask you to just look over the page, please, onto page 336, into the bullet point at the top, which states, with the endorsement of IHSL's proposal to self-deliver and appoint a third party, IMTech, NHSL accepts that the nature of the relationship with IMTech is via a standard construction industry form of contract. We previously agreed that given the nature and scale of the works, limited market interest and challenging programme aspirations, it would not be possible to impose PPP/NPD risks on a third-party contractor. Consequently, we require NHSL to accept that IMTech's liabilities would be limited to standard NEC provisions and cannot, for instance, extend to the flow down of deductions from the project agreement. Do you see that?
I do.
And again, could you just explain, perhaps in your own words, what's happened by this point? What's been communicated to you in this letter?
So through an NPD, you've clearly got a very clear establishment of where roles and responsibilities are. And clearly, in Multiplex, as the contractor, there'd be a series of warranties that would be held by, I suppose, IHSL and Multiplex. And in this case, effectively, we would be employing the new contractor, or IHSL would be employing the new contractor with the contract not tied in to the project agreement. I'm sorry, it's a while since I've talked about this, so they're not part of that NPD supply chain. They sit to the side with a different type of contract, and so their obligations would not be over the longer period of the NPD. It would be for a set period of time. So it was a different. It hadn't been done before, bringing in a separate contractor, and so this was quite unusual. And there was a significant amount of discussion about this. But certainly, from the board's perspective, there was a confidence in the contractor. So we were happy to go with this, provided it didn't dilute IHSL's responsibilities and the risk profile in the project agreement.
It doesn't alter the risk profile technically in the project agreement, but perhaps alters the overall risk profile of the project. Would that be fair?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Lord Brady, there's only one further sort of chapter of evidence I really want to cover off with Miss Goldsmith, and it's really to look at the Grant Thornton report and any reflections that she has. I wouldn't be confident of finishing that in the next 10 minutes, so that's just before 1 o'clock. It might be an appropriate point to break.
Perhaps take our break there.
Okay.
Could you be back for 2 o'clock?
2 o'clock, yes.
Thank you. Right, I'll take our lunch break.